I've been using the Panasonic S1H for about a year now. Right around when it came out is when I first bought it. Looking at all the other cameras that are coming out now with all their new features, I figured it's a good time to reassess the camera and see if it's still a viable option today. Previously, I had been using the Sony A7S II, which I absolutely loved. And after years of waiting for them to come out with a successor, this camera caught my eye. I want to start this assessment by first talking about some of the things I really like about the camera. The first thing I really noticed that I enjoyed about the camera was its physical design. It is quite comfortable to use, and it's the perfect in-between of a cinema camera and a DSLR. It's small enough to be unobtrusive, but also large enough to be held steady and host many physical buttons on the outside. Another thing that's truly impressed me about this camera is the in-body image stabilization. I've used other cameras with this feature before, but none that work quite as well as this one does. I even feel comfortable shooting handheld footage for paid jobs when it's called for. Looking at the new cameras from Sony and Canon, one thing I feel like I would miss from this camera is the top LCD screen. It's been so helpful when working alone or in small crews to see the information of importance at a glance. One thing that was really not super important to me when I first purchased the camera was the 6K video, but now I do see how big of an advantage it truly is. I rarely shoot to deliver in 6K, but having 6K footage on a 4K timeline gives you tons of flexibility. I also use the 4K 60 option quite often, but seeing that the newer cameras do 4K 120, it's something that really makes me second guess my decision to switch. Another thing I really like about this camera is the still photography aspect. I don't really use it to shoot still photos very often, but I do shoot quite a bit of time-lapse. The 24 megapixel images, in my opinion, are the perfect resolution. And I really appreciate how when you switch from photo to video mode, the camera saves your settings. It's almost like having two separate cameras, one for stills and one for video. The last thing I want to mention before I move on to the things I don't like about this camera is the dual native ISO. The dual native ISO is one of the features why I think this camera is one of the most versatile on the market. As someone who shoots so many different kinds of content in so many different scenarios, I don't always have time or the ability to set up lights. So being able to get clean, quality footage at ISO 4000 is a huge benefit. Now for some of the reasons why this camera might not be the most viable option, or at least not the best option when looking at other cameras on the market. Overall, I am super happy with the image quality of this camera and really the camera as a whole. The one major flaw, I think, is the autofocus. I can't figure out what seems to make it so bad and unreliable. I've tried different lenses, various focus modes, and many different scenarios. It always seems to fail. Even in broad daylight, it struggles to keep focused, regardless of how much the subject moves. Perhaps the most frustrating part is that the camera can actually track the subject, but it won't keep focus. If the autofocus was just a little bit better, I think everything else could be forgiven. And I know many people don't really need autofocus or don't see it as big of a deal, but for somebody who shoots by themselves often or in smaller crews like I mentioned, it is very helpful to have good autofocus. Another issue or quirk I've experienced with the camera is it's given me quite a few corrupt files. I think the problem I was having was using a slower memory card. It would still allow me to record the highest quality footage, and it would kind of freeze the camera up, and I would usually end up losing my footage, which is kind of terrifying, especially considering that I'm using this for many professional paid shoots. I'd rather not be able to record rather than being able to record and then losing the footage. Another thing that can be seen as a downside of this camera when compared to the newer Sony or Canon cameras is that it's much heavier. So that means you're going to need a larger gimbal, sturdier tripod. Everything about it is going to require more. Personally, I'm a big fan of the size and weight of the camera. The only time I really find it an issue is when you're traveling. It's really hard to fit it into any backpack that I used to use for my Sony A7S. Also, another thing to consider when looking at this camera is that it's a very specific Leica Panasonic Sigma L mount, so there's not a lot of lenses out for it just yet. You can always buy an adapter because I guess autofocus doesn't matter anyways, so that's something to consider. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that it was informative. If you are considering buying this camera, you have any questions, please feel free to leave me a comment. I'll catch you next time.